Hello, and welcome to Ask an Archaeologist. I'm Paul Duncan McGarrity. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask an Archaeologist with me, Paul Duncan McGarrity. And I come to you today live. I come to you today recorded from a hotel room in a Birmingham travel lodge because I am here for work, for archaeology, looking out, doing some of the community engagement work for a site up here. I'm all business because I'm staying in a hotel, and that is surprisingly exciting. Little things like, Wi-Fi access is included in the room, and having to say at the desk, actually, this is a business trip, and having your computer turn on in the middle of an introduction, classic business stuff. Welcome to another episode. We are talking to Dr Andrew Gardner this time. He's a lecturer at UCL, where he talks about the Roman Empire, the British Empire, and in this particular episode we also talk a fair bit about Brexit and how it will affect archaeology, both from an organisational and logistical point of view, and also what archaeology and history tells us about maybe understanding the ins and outs of where Brexit sits within the history of the British Isles, and particularly with relation to the British Empire. So, I think it's probably worth pointing out at the beginning that during this conversation, this is two people who are both anti-Brexit and are hoping that the UK and Britain remain within the EU. There you go. That's my viewpoint. You should be aware of that before we go into this, because it would be unfair for anyone who is listening to the interview to not have all of the facts going into it. I think we hopefully do a decent enough job of discussing it, but I would say that this particular one is biased towards more of the sort of biased towards wanting to remain in the EU, thinking that the idea of Brexit is a bad one, and because of that, obviously, all of our opinions are coloured to one particular viewpoint. There isn't a third party who gives the other side of things, so it is, I will fully accept, a biased interview. If that sounds like something that you would like to give it a skip, I'm giving you the chance now. But I also think there's a lot of interesting information in there. I think there's a lot of interesting relationships and a lot of interesting information regarding particularly the direct impacts that leaving the EU may have on the actual industry of archaeology, on people who are out there digging holes day in and day out, various things to do with funding, staffing, and all of those sort of considerations that may be impacted by a change in our relationship with continental Europe. There you go. That's what this one's about. Bit of a different introduction, but I thought I owed it to you to be honest about where I come with these sort of things, and I hope you appreciate that, because as we discuss later on, it's really only chatting about things and conversations that are going to help us muddle through whatever is happening. And to my international listeners, for there are many, a double apology for for talking about the British politics in this way, but it's something that is impacting lots of people I work with in a very direct fashion, and also it's just an interesting development in the history of the nation, and if you're going to understand it and where it comes from, archaeology and history is the way to go about things, because, these decisions, these moments in a country's development don't happen in a vacuum. They come from decades, centuries, millennia of incremental changes which hit these peaks in history. And I think this is particularly one. So if we were to ignore it, we'd be fools. If we were to say that we weren't influenced by our own opinions, we'd be liars. But if we didn't talk about it, we'd be idiots. So, there it is. I hope you enjoy it. I really would like to hear your feedback on this one. Just because I like to talk these things out. And I think my listenership is grown up enough to do that kind of thing. You're a cracking bunch. And I want to hear more from y'all. Will we do a question and answer one next? I don't know. I'm trying to chase a couple of people for interviews, but we'll see how it goes. In the meantime, you can send in the questions whenever you like, at Paul Duncan McGee on Twitter, do all the various other things. Yeah, I think that's everything I want to say in this introduction. I hope you enjoy this one. Let us know. This is Dr. Andy Gardner, and until next time, see you later. This episode, we're talking to Andy Gardner. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you very much. So, first things first, we'll talk about... You are a lecturer, is that right?
Yeah, well, senior lecturer, technically, in the Archaeology of the Roman Empire.
Oh, fantastic. And that's at UCL, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Institute of Archaeology?
At the Institute of Archaeology, yeah.
Yeah. How long have you been there for?
Well, so I've been a staff member there since 2005, so that's nearly 15 years. And before that, though, I did all my degrees there. So from to 95 as an undergrad, then 97, 3 years master's, then 3.5 years PhD, and then I worked for a bit afterwards. So went away for a little bit and then came back.
Yeah, it would be fair to say that you enjoy the place then.
Yeah, I think that would be fair, yeah.
That's excellent. But you said you took a little bit of a break. Did you do a little bit of commercial archaeology in there as well?
I did, yeah. Between my BA and MA, I did most of that year was in commercial archaeology, and then worked in a couple of other universities after I got my PhD before getting a lectureship.
If I'm right, it's Leicester, Reading and Cardiff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So but mostly most of your academic career has been at UCL.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the institute is quite a special place. So yeah, privileged to get a job there and then to work there, having studied there.
Well, that's quite interesting then. Let's. Not a lot of people would maybe know what a lecturer does in the day to day. What a typical day is there? First of all, such a thing as a typical, and if there is, what kind of things do you get up to?
Interesting question. I mean, in a way, there isn't. Or another way of putting it would be that a typical day is quite a varied one. So, my job is sort of stranded. I have to, obviously, at some points of the year, teaching is a big part of it. Other times, such as we're kind of moving into now, the emphasis shifts a bit more to research. There's always different sorts of administration, student administration, but also other sorts of things. And yeah, I mean, I guess the way I think about it, I mean, it's no job's perfect, obviously, and there are also stresses and strains. Yeah. And that's the price of the freedom, I guess. So, it's a job where you have a lot of flexibility and autonomy. Yeah. But there's always too much to do. So
I see.
You have a lot of freedom to choose among the things you can do, not all of which you're going to get done that day.
I see. So basically, it's trying to balance the requirements of the job, things like the teaching side of things, the marking side of things, with the research elements, the things that sort of fascinate you about it.
Yeah. I mean, although obviously, I mean, you can equally flip that around and say, I mean, I really like teaching. I'm expected to do research. It's not quite so simple.
That's nice to hear, at least, particularly for the students.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, to be brutally honest, I could write a paper that will be read by 5 people, or I can give a lecture to a class of 50 people. One of them has more impact than the other.
Yeah.
In a good way. So teaching is absolutely important and enjoyable. And quite a bit more so than research a lot of the time, actually, because research can be kind of lonely, and certainly in the way I do it, which is basically just as a individual, really. There's obviously different ways people do research, and I guess in the kind of sciencey end of things, you tend to have bigger teams of people, but I'm more at the humanities end or the social science end, more individual kind of research.
Yeah.
So... Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, when did you first start giving lectures as part of your through your career, and what was that like? That first kind of lecture that you had to give?
Yeah, I guess that would have been when I was a PhD student. So in fact, I think actually something like 98 or 9. So yeah, 20 years ago. Wow. And the first lecturing was terrifying. Yeah, I don't think I'm I wouldn't say naturally kind of gregarious in the sense of just being able to stand up and do that. It's taken practice to get to the point where I do feel comfortable doing that.
So what sort of support do they give to someone who's giving their first lectures? What kind of preparation do you have before you put out in front of a class?
That's another good question. Well, in those days there wasn't as much training as there is now.
Right. They're just all like, you'll be fine.
So, yeah, it was kind of like that, really.
You spend most of your time alone in a museum. I'm sure you'll be fine in front of these young students.
Yeah, it's you do get thrown in. I suppose, though, at that time or shortly thereafter, I was also doing quite a bit of adult education teaching, which was really good. And actually, it's a sad fact that whole kind of sector has dwindled significantly in the last kind of 15 years, I guess.
Yeah. By that, do you mean sort of like night schools? And
yeah, exactly.
That kind of thing. I see.
Yeah, which used to be supported by various institutions, had whole kind of departments. Reading, that's where I was working there in the Department of Continuing Education, which then got closed down because there were changes to the funding, which meant it no longer, well, from the university's point of view, no longer viable, I suppose. But that sort of thing, quite a few of my contemporaries were doing as a way of building up teaching experience.
So it was, the onus was on you to try and find if you wanted to go out and get the experience, you had to go and find an opportunity to do that.
Yeah. But there were more opportunities out there in different sorts of places, and talking to different groups of people. Mainly retired people who were just interested in the subject.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it was easier by any means. They can ask interesting questions, challenging questions, that sort of stuff. But it wasn't quite like where not everyone was doing assessments, and it was all a bit more kind of for enjoyment. So it's a different kind of atmosphere.
Yeah. Because obviously, when you started lecturing, has there been a change in the attitude of the students that you're working with? Because possibly, this is just my understanding, is the way that they're funded and the end result that they require from their degree might have changed slightly. Is there any change in attitude linked to that?
Yeah, I think there is. I think at the Institute it's not so bad, but generally speaking, I feel that fees are bad because obviously, really, they've commercialised the relationship. They've corroded some of the kind of sense of all being in it together as scholars, and it's not the same anymore.
No, it's more sort of like a value-added thing.
And it's interesting. Obviously, universities across the sector have responded in quite similar ways, partly by expanding estate, building new things, and to be fair, that's not bad. We've got a new student centre at UCL that's really good. But in other ways, we haven't had loads more staff to teach those people, for example.
Right.
We have been able easily to add lots of extra contact time, for which you would need more staff.
Yes.
So there are some areas where it places more pressure on an existing structure without that being kind of acknowledged. And I suppose ultimately, of course, there's a sort of ideological problem almost, that the change to fees was simply replacing government money with money coming more directly from students. It didn't actually necessarily in itself lead to a big uplift in the amount of money. That's only come as universities have kind of tried to get more students. But on the kind of baseline when that first came in, and what people are worried about now with fees maybe being cut, but again, the question of whether there'll be money to replace that, is if the total pot doesn't get bigger, but it's just coming more directly from students. From a perception point of view, obviously that's really significant, but actually there's not necessarily more money than there was before.
Right.
So it's redirecting responsibility onto students and making us feel more under pressure because of that. Yeah. But we're kind of stuck.
Yeah,
so that has been frustrating.
That is, so that's a significant change, because obviously when you were an undergraduate as well, there's something about this. What do you think you were always going to go into being an academic? Was that always your end goal?
Well, with hindsight now, it's kind of hard to say anything other than that. When I suppose the kind of pivot really was when after my BA, and I was thinking at that time of doing a master's, but I couldn't really get my head around the application when I was trying to finish my bachelor's, so I took a year out, worked in the Virgin Megastore over Christmas.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
So you have an active a participation in a dead and archaeological artifact.
Yeah, indeed, selling CDs in a shop.
Physical CDs, my God.
But then, which I still buy, of course. But then, I got work with the Bedford unit as it was then, now Albion Archaeology. And I guess I don't know now. I can't remember exactly what my thought processes were. Whether I thought, this will be fine, I can do this for years.
Yeah.
But I had in that year applied for a master's place, and then I got the funding to do it, and that was that really. So
that was it. You've not looked back
if I hadn't
since.
got that funding, then who knows? It could have been very, very different. But again, I was lucky in the sense that at that point there was more funding available for postgrad degrees than there is these days.
Yeah. What was it that made you want to do archaeology in the first place?
That's a good question. So I guess it kind of emerged in my mid sort of teens. I was pretty enthusiastic about history, as you might imagine, but didn't really see that as very practical or kind of leading to a job that definitely involved doing that thing. Went to Boxgrove when I was 16 as my first dig. And that was that. I just applied for archaeology degrees, and it was, a bit tough. And I guess this is still a problem that, careers in my school, the careers tutor was good, but couldn't really, archaeology is a weird thing to careers tutors.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's one of our problems that we have as a discipline. We have to always struggle against it not being seen as even sort of necessarily a comprehensible career, let alone a viable one.
You've got a hand, though, in sort of trying to change that. You're involved in organising the University Archaeology Day, is that right?
Yes, with my colleagues Charlotte Frierson and Jenny French at UCL and Carl Heron at the VM.
Yeah. Charlotte Frierson, formerly of this parish.
Exactly, yes. We started that precisely to try and do something about this. I mean, it's been a thought that certainly I've had, and the others too, for a long time, of how we have a problem and we can sit there all day kind of bemoaning it, but obviously you have to just try and do something about it as well.
Yeah.
So we with the support of the kind of organisation that represents all university departments, UA UK, we got it going a couple of years ago, and the aim of that is simply to try and provide a kind of one-stop place for people who want to do archaeology to come and see every university department represented.
Yeah.
Find out more about it, hear from different organisations which employ archaeologists.
I was going to say, it's not just universities.
No, absolutely. Yeah, exactly, because it's got to be about the whole range of things you can do. Because, I mean, to me, and certainly to the others, archaeology is the best degree. It's the total thing. It's whatever you're interested in, you can do it in archaeology. And it makes you the best sort of person in terms of all-round skills, and not just academic ones, obviously practical ones and social ones. And
What kind of advantage does archaeology have in the modern world? Does it have some sort of bearing on understanding what's going on around us, or is it sort of like, can you not draw those comparisons? Is it just we understanding the past?
Well, I think there are several things happening right now that would not be happening if people understood the past. And those, of course, are bad things that are happening now, in my view. So I think if you... it's not just, I mean, you know, it's kind of a classic interview question that when we still did interviews and thing that people say, and I said it myself, you know.
Do you not do interviews anymore?
No, unfortunately not, no.
That's definitely the only reason I got given a place.
Well,
I could talk a really good game.
But, you know, it's common to say, oh, we need to understand the past to avoid making the same mistakes. And I think whilst that is true, it's also... It doesn't seem to work because we do still make the same mistakes, even though people at least begin to understand the past. But it's not just about knowing that Brexit's a big mistake because of the history of interaction between the British Isles and the rest of Europe and the situation in Ireland and all these issues. It's not just about that. It's also about being open-minded, because to me an archaeologist has a massively open mind to the... different ways people have lived, the different things that people have done, the range of human experience, the need to think critically about everything you kind of read. And all those skills are not just about kind of specific knowledge of historical precedents. They're also about the kind of person you become while studying it. And I think in that sense, it's really a good education in a lot of different things.
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to come back to the Brexit thing, because you wrote a very interesting paper in 2016 about sort of like how the Brexit was sort of the continuation of the end of the British Empire.
Yes, yeah.
If I remember correctly. And I'd like to talk to you about that one.
Yeah, sure.
But before we do that, how can archaeologists better communicate this?
Well, that's a good question too.
Just to tie back in, because obviously with the lecturing side of things, you know, there's a little bit of... I've always felt it was a bit mean to have so many performative elements of academia for people who are quite regularly timid. Yeah. Like there's not just lecturing, but there's also presenting papers and things like that. There's quite a gregarious element of it. And I've certainly sat through some talks where I thought, you could have done with some improv training, something.
Yeah. No, you're quite right. I mean, that's very true. There's not exactly a strong correlation between the things you do when you're doing a PhD and the things you need to do when you're lecturing or talking. Quite the opposite, really. And arguably, people well disposed towards doing one of those things, maybe not so well disposed to the other. I mean, I think it's really interesting that, when I was an undergraduate, we were in the middle of the kind of time team bubble of really high numbers of people going into archaeology, relatively speaking. And that burst around the turn of the millennium, I guess, when numbers started to drop in terms of applicants.
Yeah.
So, you know, that program was doing a pretty good job of communicating some good things about archaeology that made people want to do it. Obviously, it's not just about that, though. It's about communicating the kind of significance of archaeological thinking and findings to people who are not going to become archaeologists. But so one of the problems then, I guess, is that since that era, the media landscape is really fragmented. So it's quite hard, I'd say, now for any program to replicate that success. Also, obviously, the problem very much bound up with Brexit is the kind of polarization of opinion. And there's a really good paper by Kenny Brophy in Antiquity just before Christmas.
Yeah, where he's talking about how people keep using Brexit, using archaeology to support and undermine Brexit. He uses the argument on both sides. Yeah,
exactly. And that then, you know, with stories that are coming out now, people, at least people who write, you know, comments, below the line comments on websites and whatever, will immediately kind of challenge whatever is being said on the basis of the political orientation they have to it. Right. So it's difficult now because we have, certainly, I mean, there are lots of things we could do in terms of improving communication skills and working with people who have great communication skills to get messages across in different media. But like across lots of different disciplines, even ones where I would say there's not much room for quibbling, like with climate change or with the necessity of vaccinating children against diseases. Mm-hmm. There are lots of people who increasingly don't want to listen to what academics or anyone working with expert knowledge, so-called, is trying to communicate. So the barriers are, it's not only that we have sort of means of communication is more complicated, but also that there are more barriers to that communication.
The way that arguments are being structured.
Yeah. And so I'm sort of, I do worry. I mean, I've decided, I guess, that I'm going to be pretty open about how my politics relates to my work, because they do relate. It's unavoidable. And I guess I think I'm right about politics on the basis of the way I understand the world.
Yeah.
So it's sort of pointless to deny that. But equally, I realise that might be a problem. But I don't think we can communicate a neutral past, because the past is always, as Brexit shows. I mean, and other things happening around the world, in the US or other countries where at the moment predominantly right-wing forces are using certain narratives about the past, whether it's 30 or 40 years ago or 200 years ago, it doesn't really matter, to impose an exclusionary view of the world on people, and that is troubling.
So do you make when you're lecturing, does your personal politics come into it? And do you make a point of making people aware of that your personal point is included in the material you're teaching?
Increasingly, yes. Yeah. In fact, in the last couple of weeks of term, which just finished, I did a couple of things in other people's courses on Brexit, and they were pretty openly. Well, it's pretty clear where I'm coming from, because there's no doubt that Brexit is going to be destructive of British archaeology. So I don't see why I should hide that fact.
Yeah. So this is what I wanted to get worth getting to. First of all, I think this is in two parts. The paper that you wrote 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know how well you remember it, but I think it is. I hope it's on the forefront of your mind. I just wanted to know, from when you wrote that paper to now that we've left the EU. Oh wait,
right, we have.
In those 2 years,
yeah.
If anything that you had considered previously has changed or evolved, and sort of like what your thinking was then, what your thinking is now, and how you've seen the political arguments develop for Brexit, and the other side of it as well is there any direct sort of effects that will occur to the industry of archaeology in the UK? I'm thinking things like funding, staffing, etc.
Yes, well, let me take the second first, because in a way that's easier, or also maybe a shorter answer, which is that, yes, there will be bad effects. I mean, at the moment, and there's a couple of good articles on this by Mike Hayworth and Mike Pitts of the CBA in the British Archaeology magazine over the last year or two. So the UK, study of the past in the UK, research into the past, attract way more EU funding, European funding, than any other country in Europe. So we get absolutely the lion's share of European funding in pursuing archaeological research. And then within UK academia, let me get this right, but I think within UK academia, archaeology is the discipline with the highest proportion of its total funding coming from Europe. It's about 40% of research funding in archaeology. Wow. So there are other disciplines which sort of have, more money sloshing about, but for us, the proportion of that which is from Europe is the greatest. So obviously, it's possible that will be replaced, but I'd say two things about that. One is that the utter chaos in government at the moment makes me untrusting, shall we say, of any assurances about future states of research funding coming from purely UK sources. And also, I'd be worried about the nationalist direction that might start to take.
I fear we may be very far down a list of priorities.
I think so.
Yeah. Like, let's get the archaeology sorted first, and then Calais.
Yeah,
the Dover-Calais border.
Exactly. I mean, if you think about all the absolutely crazy stuff, to stockpiling of different things. I mean, and there are, in archaeology, I guess, now people are actually stockpiling certain research materials.
I mean, at least with our archives, we've got like experience stockpiling things.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
It'll all be really well labelled.
Yeah. But then obviously there's a long list of other things that have been badly neglected for the last 2 years, which are probably more important than, or at least more immediately so than archaeology. But then there's also the huge numbers of my friends and colleagues who work in the Institute and elsewhere in British archaeology who come from other European countries. Lots of field units that have a lot of their workforce coming from other European countries. Yeah.
I mean, it's only anecdotal, but a significant proportion of the company I work for is Italian, Spanish, sort of like Dutch, German, a huge swathe of people from across the EU.
Yeah.
And they're all worried.
Yeah, and there are British archaeologists working in other European countries too. And all of them are going to be directly affected, but all of us are going to be affected because I don't like seeing my friends leave the country because they don't feel welcome anymore. And I don't like to lose the collaborations that have been built over the last years with lots of people from different places.
What's the benefit of having those viewpoints in art?
Well, again, I mean, like the subject itself, it's about broadening your horizons. I mean, if you're stuck in your own national narrative, you're very closed and you're not able to imagine the scope of different things that have happened in the past and the culture's work, which is what archaeology is about. It's about the comparison between different cultural traditions, how they change over time, how they interact with each other, and that is literally what the European Union has facilitated us to do for the whole of my lifetime. And to see it go is the greatest tragedy I have had to confront in my lifetime. In terms of politics.
So we'll go back to the first question then. So the identity of Britain. Exactly.
Yeah.
What's the impact there? What are we learning there?
I mean, so your question earlier was whether my views have changed since I wrote that paper a couple of years ago, and I guess the simple answer is not really. It's just been ever more breathtaking lesson in how
just for the benefit of the listeners, could you give a quick sort of précis what that was talking about 2 years ago?
Okay, so it was a paper that was doing a couple of things. One was to compare processes of change in empires over time with the Roman Empire, which is my kind of main research area, and the British Empire, and see how think about how in the longer term sort of perspective, empires are sort of I'd say kind of inevitably going to fragment because of the way that the imperial culture changes over time.
And entropy.
Yeah, right, yeah. And that there's a sort of collapsing of the British Empire, which is what Brexit seems to me to manifest right down to its sort of core. If you think about England, and England as really, in terms of the referendum result, a large proportion of the Leave vote is coming from England and from certain regions of England, non-metropolitan England, particularly in the eastern, sort of the whole of the eastern seaboard, really, of England, from Kent to Tyneside. And England began the process of the British Empire about 1,000 years ago by conquering other bits of what is now Great Britain and Ireland, of course. And so from that then up to the kind of global empire and then back, it seems sort of there's an arc of history there where England is left as this kind of hollow, angry place. And there's this disjuncture between English and British identity because British identity became a more hybridized imperial identity, which was in some ways, that was about domination and rule, but it also allowed for a degree of cultural interchange, and that's why tea drinking becomes a symbol of Britishness, because tea isn't grown in England, but it's a cultural importation, I suppose. But then the local identities in the UK become maybe sort of detached from that, and it's clear again. And in that paper, I refer to the fact that in the 2011 census, when people were asked about their sort of the national identity they identified most with, there is an interesting pattern with British identity being stronger in the big cities where you've got more mixed populations, and then in particularly Eastern England, English identity, not British identity, is more prominent in people's minds.
That's really interesting.
More British,
more insular, sort of like smaller country.
Yeah. And so that kind of fragmentation is, it's a post-imperial phenomenon, and it's not dissimilar to other sort of post-colonial contexts where identities are transformed by the process of empire. And it's...
So is it a case of, because you said like that you leave this little angry England, but is it potentially that it's a confused England, an England that doesn't quite know where it is anymore?
Yeah, sure. Yes, and of course I'd say maybe also controversial. No, I don't think it's that controversial, but an England that's partly confused because it's been misled by some of its leaders. I mean, the blaming of the EU for problems which have nothing to do with the EU has been going on for pretty much as long as we've been members.
Right.
And the failure to teach people really about the history of the British Empire, the failure to address some of its darker legacies, of which there are several. The myth of empire is something that should be returned to, even though in the sense that Brexit is also about the economy of globalization and how that's left people, jobless. Obviously, that's really terrible. But that process began within the context of the British Empire. We can't go back to the thing that led to the thing that we don't like anymore. It's just
so. All right then. What would you? How would you like to see the discipline of archaeology going about addressing some of the issues of identity that are tied up to this end of empire? And is there a sort of like, is there something that you can see from other empires ending that post-colonial period that gives you hope of what we could eventually?
That's quite an ambitious
to
think about.
I know, we can't just point fingers, we have to see how it gets better.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I mean, I think obviously in a way, as with the problems of funding and so on, archaeology is only a small part of a project. And in quite a lot of ways, I suppose I feel that it's not really about me as an archaeologist doing anything that I happen to do, or any of us. It's about us as citizens. But I think, well, I don't know, it's hard to express this without coming across as trying to impose my values on lots of people, but I think they're quite good values. I think they're values that, tolerance, acceptance, being able to get along with people who aren't from the same place as you originally, all those things.
They're particularly hard values when you're trying to make other people accept them.
Well, yes, indeed. One of those paradoxes of being a liberal, I suppose. But I mean, I think clearly right now, in a way, it's hard to imagine that, partly because the political process has got so utterly screwed up. I mean, there has been some talk, and I think Gordon Brown actually wrote about this in The Guardian yesterday, that it would be good to have a longer extension and then have some citizen assemblies, as happened has happened recently in Ireland and has happened elsewhere, where people can start to talk to each other, because it is, in a context which is sort of set up in such a way that you're not going to just be shouting at people as you engage in counter protests on a big march, or other kind of contexts that have been on TV and so on. But we need to have more in-depth discussions where we can bring our understandings to bear on each other, and also, of course, understand more about the other side. Because at the moment, Britain looks pretty comprehensively up the creek.
I mean, we're split about what, 52-48%?
Yeah. It's and obviously those are at least for probably actually I'd say a growing proportion of each of those halves is pretty kind of hardened in their views, partly because of the way the whole process has been grotesquely mishandled, I would say. But
yeah, I mean, I personally, I know we're right in the middle of it, but I weirdly still have hope for us because, I get to travel around the country and meet people, and they're all just people. They're fine.
Yeah.
And, they disagree with me on a lot of different things, but we can chat, face to face you can chat things through, but online and in protests, it's a lot harder to do.
No, but some way of making that chat
stick
and be the kind of be more part of the process of how to get through this.
Yeah. I think we've got more in common than we have apart. That's something from archaeology as well. Like,
yes,
you just realise that people are people are people are people are people all the way back.
Yeah.
Like the what's it called? The letter from the Mithraeum of someone complaining that someone owes them money. I was like, oh, it's just people.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, people do ultimately mostly care about the same sorts of things in terms of health, health, well-being, love and happiness and all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And it's not helpful to see people as enemies. That's obviously one of the things I object to about the way the EU has been portrayed and the way the EU is continuing to be portrayed in some of the media as the enemy instead of our long-term allies and friends. So no, it would be hypocritical of me to sink into that same sort of stuff.
But doesn't it feel nice?
Well, it's easier.
Yeah.
Sometimes, quite a lot of the time.
Exactly. Can I ask you? We'll come off this now. This has been really interesting, and thank you for going into that because it's one of those things that occasionally bring it up, and you can just see people go, "Oh no, not touching that with a barge pole." So thank you for talking about it. I really appreciate it. Why do you? What is it about the Roman Empire that interests?
Well, I guess that's changed, and it's partly because of the things happening, especially now, and so. I mean, I guess I wasn't entirely committed to being a Romanist when I started my degree. Kind of happened by accident a little bit. There were good teachers of that at the time in the Institute, Richard Rees and Mark Hassel and John Wilkes. And
Mark Hassel.
Yeah.
I caught him at the tail end of his career. He nearly took my head off with a sword, but
Right. So then I... at the time, though, I guess I had a fairly traditional understanding, I suppose, of what the Roman Empire was about and why it was interesting. That changed as I got more into archaeological theory during my postgrad degrees, and then now it's all about what makes an empire work, how it changes over time, how it's not just about imposing a sort of top-down culture on conquered people, but actually how the whole the sort of the heart of the empire has changed drastically over time as well, which is what I was just kind of talking about in a way, really, that the heart of empire, as in Britain, has also changed, and how empires they kind of screw everyone up, I guess, and that's not diminish the inequalities, obviously massively drastic, but they
no one gets away clean.
Exactly. And just as the British Empire, and the Roman Empire, there are all kinds of horrific things that happened all over the world. But also in the British context, the class system was built on exploitation of people within Britain to serve in British armies overseas, and the industrialisation which developed and then sort of began the process of outsourcing, basically. All these things also created the conditions for where we are now. So understanding the kind of process of empire, how it affects different regions within it, and all of that is more interesting now than what I started off being interested in, which was Roman legionary equipment and battle tactics and that sort of stuff.
Fair enough.
My cat is paying us a visit. I should.
Yes, which probably means I already have the answer to one of my closing questions, but we'll get to that when we get to it.
Okay.
Before we do, though, If there was someone who was wanting to get into academia, what kind of advice would you give them for if they're starting out now in a career where they want to get to a point where they're lecturing?
So I guess the main thing is to try, as you go through, obviously you have to, these days very much so, there's a pathway of 3 degrees basically. I'd say that it's good to try and keep a degree of kind of flexibility, not to become too specialised too quickly, because the more different things you can teach, the better when you get to the point of applying for jobs. And also, as you're doing particularly the postgrad stuff, it's important to do, I mean, it actually, this kind of relates back to something I said at the beginning to do with the kind of workload. Obviously, part of being an academic is about doing more things than you have time to, because you want to do all of those things. You want to give that paper, you want to go to that conference, you want to get this research project going, you want to talk to these students, you want to, there's loads of things you want to do, and you kind of, in a way, I guess this sounds bad, but you have to kind of get used to being, to taking on more stuff, to doing stuff, to being involved. That's what it is about. And so it's important to put yourself out there, basically, I suppose is what I'm saying, to go and speak at a conference as soon as you can, to certainly go to conferences, to try and get a couple of publications done. Academia is a lot about, like you said, about performativity, and that's not just in the lecture room, it's also how you kind of perform via your presence on social media or in publications, making people aware that you exist and you've thoughts, and those are good thoughts.
Yeah.
So doing stuff, basically.
Brilliant. Okay. Right, we'll close it out with the last 2 questions. Okay, first one, I think I already know the answer, but sight cat or sight dog?
Yeah, sight cat, definitely.
Yeah, considering one just jumped on you while we were doing the interview, I was like, okay, that one's already busted.
Against dogs, I like dogs, but I think sight cat would be more easy to deal with in terms of being able to be left alone for a bit more, but also more amusing in terms of sitting on the edge of the trench, looking scornfully.
Very cool. And last question. You work in the heritage industry, but how would you like to be remembered?
As a nice person.
Cool.
That's it, really.
Is there anything you'd like to plug, like the date of maybe the University Archaeology Day or anything like that?
So 2 things, I guess. One would be that the University Archaeology Day, which this year we're moving slightly later in the year, but so it'll be on the 12th of October, Saturday.
And whereabouts is that?
At the British Museum.
Okay, cool.
And there already is some stuff on social media, but you can just look it up, University Archaeology Day. And the other thing would be TAG, the Theoretical Archaeology Group Conference that we're having at UCL in December, the 16th to 18th of December. Again, that's on our website.
Wonderful. Andy, thank you very much for talking to me. That was really cool.
No problem. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Ask an Archaeologist podcast with me, Paul Duncan McGarrity. The music you were listening to was by From the Ashes. Check them out on Bandcamp. It was produced by me, Paul Duncan McGarrity. You can follow me on Twitter at askanarch, or you can send an email at askanarch@gmail.com. But most importantly, if you've enjoyed yourself and you think you have a friend who might be interested in the podcast, please tell them about it. Write a review, put up a star rating, let people know that we're here. It's incredibly helpful and much appreciated. Once again, thank you to everyone who has asked an arc. Bye-bye.